I'm sure his last name would be Smith.
Because there's so many.
So many of those. No, I'm sorry that way.
No, that's silly.
Just due to the time period and the cultural context, his technical last name, if you want to call it that, is of Nazareth, because you were marked by where you're from.
Or son of.
Yeah, or son of.
Mm-hmm.
So he technically has a last name, but
So he probably was in a particular tribe.
Yeah.
At that time the tribes were divided
the tribe
into
of
the
David.
12. Yeah. So actually, if you look at the history of names, and if you look at the translations that the New Testament went through, it was not written in English, obviously, right?
Yes.
It was written in Aramaic, and that was translated, I think, into the Greek, and then into something else. And there's some question that his name was actually Joshua rather than.
So I really don't mean to interject. I did a paper on this in college, so I
Oh,
get
good.
excited about this. No, his name before translated is Yeshua.
Mm-hmm. Y-E-H.
Yeah.
Something.
It's
Shua.
there's. Do you mind if I write it down just to?
No, that's fine. I've got it as Jeshua.
Oh, that's one spelling of it. Where's the dry erase marker?
Is it there?
Oh, I see. I promise I do not mean to step on your thing.
Oh, you're not stepping on.
I just get excited about this. No, Yeshua. Let's see. That is not.
But it's interesting that the first thing we ask of a person is, what is your name? And if you suddenly found out that you were addressing someone by the wrong name, it would make you feel a bit off your mark or a bit off kilter.
You mean you've never done that?
All the time. But we also assume that Jesus Christ, some people think that Christ was the second name, like I'm JoAnn Croom, but that's not true. Do you know when the Christ part was first added?
Well, Paul put it to the Greeks. It's a Greek term.
And it means,
Oh, gee, what does it?
The deliverer.
or the anointed one.
The anointed one. That's what it means.
So sometimes you hear people profanely say Jesus H. Christ. What does the H stand for? I have no
I
idea.
have no idea. Maybe that is their way of making it not quite so
Profane.
profane.
Could be. But people will,
That's what it looks like in the Hebrew as well.
yeah, you can see that the Hebrew language doesn't use our conventional letters,
Actually,
not the Roman style letters. So Yeshua or Joshua, as we would call it, or Jesus. Does it make any difference what the name is?
Is Yahweh? Where would I have heard that?
That's God.
Okay, that's God.
That's the God. Yeah.
I don't know, you almost feel like they're nicknames.
Yes, you do. It makes no difference whether you know the name correctly or what the name really was. That was just a moment in time. But the most important thing is Jesus' way. And I was reading one thing and it said you could boil it down to 3 parts. Simplicity, justice, and inclusion. Does that sound okay to you?
Mm-hmm.
So my next question is, what would Jesus be doing today?
Crying.
He'd be a social justice warrior in a lot of people's eyes.
So you think he would be working for changing society?
Yeah.
Okay.
And you're right, John. I think he would be sad.
You don't think he wasn't sad then?
Yes, but I think he would still be sad.
Yeah.
You would think after all these years of Christianity and churches and good works and all of this stuff, we might have evolved to the point where we were human beings to each other. But we can almost as big a mess as we ever were.
I think that simplicity thing is a very important part about justice and inclusion. The Sermon on the Mount, and where he fed the 5,000, is kind of a focal part as far as the teaching. And what happened, what I remember in my readings and stuff, is the apostles get all worried. We got this mob of 5,000 people. We've been doing these signs. They're going to want food. And Jesus was like, you guys are worried about, let's keep it simple. You're making a big to-do. And I would suggest that in today's society, he would be doing the same thing. To make justice and inclusion happen, do we really, and of course I'm showing my own bias here, and just because of the way I see the Jesus way, is that things get real big, they require a lot of administration, they get complicated, and when you have a hard time with justice, when you have a big and a little. And it'd be nice if we are all one family, all parts are the same, which means we don't need big pieces and little pieces. And I think if he was in today's world as he's moving around, he'd be moving around too. He wouldn't go to the churches. Where would he be?
With the people.
He'd be with the people. He'd go to the poorest spots, the littlest people, the most marginalized, and he'd be moving around, and he would be preaching. Everybody should have, you shouldn't have bigger rights and littler rights. I'll let it stop there.
He might be in some churches to turn over some tables and shake some things up.
Well, yeah, maybe the mega things where it's all about how much money can I make for. This is a good Christian life I've got here preaching the gospel.
Or having Paul write some letters to the church today.
Yeah, saying shake that.
He'd be overturning the money changers tables.
The
Follow the
banks
money.
are being overturned as
Yeah.
we speak.
Yes.
So have you ever set your heart on something, whatever, let's say a car, a particular car, and once you get it, you find that it doesn't fit? It's hard to park, or it takes up too much room, or it makes you worry that you're gonna run into something and dent it.
I think if that were the case, mine would look a little bit different.
If you put too much money in a dress and wear it to a party, you're afraid to eat anything for you to spill it on the dress, you know, that it costs too much money.
To me, that's one of the hallmarks of having ADHD, is you're chasing that dopamine high. I have 50 different crafts I've started that are just sitting in little piles amongst my house, hoping that they'll get finished. Like I've picked up, and I mean like, I'm one of those jack of all trades, master of none. I picked up macrame, knitting, crocheting, sewing, embroidery, cross stitch. I like to mechanic for fun. I like to do archery, it's just, you're constantly, and I think that's the really nice thing about my faith, is it's always been this anchor. And being ADHD, you kind of become obsessed with whatever you're super into at that moment. Like you just burrow into it. And that was the nice thing about going to college as a theology major. I just got to burrow into something that I've been doing my whole life, which is studying the Bible. And I did 30-page papers on tactical warfare during the biblical period, and I just enjoyed stuff like that, So it's where do you center your dopamine high?
And sometimes we make them more complex and difficult than they need to be.
Yeah.
is faith at its purest form, is it complex or is it simple?
The people I've known that I thought had the greatest amount of faith were usually simple people.
They didn't worry about what might be a stumbling block that I would consider to be an important issue.
It's complex when you don't want to make it the center of your life and make it a convenience item. That's when it gets complex.
And it doesn't necessarily have to be a rational decision.
No.
It could be an emotional decision, and emotions are generally pretty simple. You either love someone or you don't.
Yeah.
Or you like them or you don't. Okay, simplicity. If you were designing your life to be simple, what would you do differently?
Have fewer material things, or put less emphasis on material things. I used to joke with my professor when I was in grad school that my next house was going to be a mobile home, you know, just a RV or something, just simple.
My grandmother told me, this was many years after my grandfather had died, that she wished that she had not been, she was always working. She was always acquiring. She was very strong in her faith, but she boarded students and did this and did that. And my grandfather went off and worked in the CC, I guess it was the CC camps, because he wrote letters to Granny in pencil. From there, I can remember finding one or two of them. And she said she wished they had taken more time to have, and I think she said fun, but she said she wished that they had taken more time, I guess, to enjoy life.
To appreciate each other. Yeah. And I think about my grandmother. One of them was, they had a very simple house. They had a very simple way of life. She didn't have a vacuum cleaner. She didn't have, I don't know whether they had a mop or not. They had a broom. But she had more time than I ever managed to find with all of my electronic devices that were supposed to make life easy. She would, every night after supper, she would go in and sit down and do nothing or do something that she wanted to do. About justice, let's look at justice a minute. That's a tough one because we can see that there is a different type of justice in our country, which is supposed to be equal under the law.
Yeah, how would you define justice?
Is it equal opportunity?
I'm gonna see what Google says if I can get into this
Well,
thing.
it starts with just. Just is right. The rightness of things.
Fair.
The rightness of things, is it really have to be fair? Just the rightness, the order? Everybody has, that's a word that gets moved around a lot.
Mm-hmm.
What order?
Justice.
Yeah.
I'm for justice, but it's not one of my big motivators. You know,
What you got?
Just behavior or treatment, a concern for justice, peace, genuine respect for people. Similar fairness. I can do more, but does that, shall I go further?
Does it mean that all people should have equal amounts of money for basic needs?
Be nice, wouldn't it?
Well, the thing is how to arrive at that. There are people who work 3 jobs and still don't have enough money to survive, and there are people who have inherited money and it's gone down and down and down and down. I'm sure maybe some of the people have worked very hard. Not all billionaires and millionaires have just laid back in their recliners. But what bothers me is maybe back to the opportunity. There's not the opportunity sometimes for everybody, no matter how hard they work, to achieve even enough to have a medium style life.
I was an only child, which meant that I inherited what my parents had worked for, and they had inherited something from their parents, which made my life easier than my cousins' lives, who were, some of them were in families of 7 or 8. So there wasn't much left for some of them.
I'm one of 6. And I remember my brother, my oldest sibling, was able to go to college and not pay for anything. And my sister, my oldest sister as well, the sister just older than me, was able to go to college because she won a scholarship. And then I came along and there was no money for me to go to college. I had to earn my way. So I had to get a job and earn my way through college. And so did my younger brother and sister. And I think my youngest brother, who was the baby of the family, was able to go to college with more financial support from my parents.
Because he was the
boy.
only kid.
He was a boy. So.
But would it have been just,
so it
just
should be, right?
equally say everybody gets everything? Or, I mean, I think of justice in terms of treatment of people. I mean, just because that's, and I somehow I have law in there somewhere. But
Well, there is a difficulty somehow in the black community of not being able to leave to your children, or your property gets subsumed by a new housing development or a new building thing. And so they have presented the case that they have been cut out of their generational.
And that was the treatment of, and it still is the treatment.
And so there's the word repatriation. What is that word?
Reparation.
Reparation, okay. I knew it was R-E something. Reparation. So that's another thing that's always thought of as being a problem, but there's not any easy fix.
Have
It's
you
a big
ever
problem.
seen the, I think it's on PBS, but it talks about, I want to say it was the Wall Street, it was the Black Wall Street in
Tulsa.
Yes, Tulsa.
Yes.
And it was awful. It was terrible. And
It was similar in Wilmington, North Carolina, and in from 1950 to the end of the 1960s, if I'm not mistaken, it was also maybe not quite as violent, but very similar in Nashville with what they did with Eagle Street and that area.
We had that in Columbia. There was an area that was predominantly black near the university. And of course, that got taken over for housing for people in the university. And those people were left without much at all. Their houses were sold for next to nothing. But you see that in every community. I know when expressways have been built, it takes away farmland, it takes away all kinds of communities, not just black.
I read an article that, I don't know if it's true or not, I'm your opinion, that if churches really took an interest, if each church in the U.S. would take an interest in the down and out people around them, that we wouldn't have a problem. But do you think that's really true? I don't know.
Well, until we try it, we won't know if that's true.
I don't know. I think there's so much power and wealth that overrules everything.
But Jesus' way doesn't give you power except being just, I think, does convey power in some ways, in a way which is more in keeping, I guess, with the Declaration of Independence and with what the founding fathers, some of them might have had in mind. So we keep always wanting to be independent, don't we?
Mm-hmm.
That was instilled in the culture that I grew up in. You want to take care of yourself. You don't want to owe anybody. And if you die and you owe somebody a nickel, it's a bad thing. Somebody should go and pay
that nickel.
That nickel for you. Yeah.
But in some ways, isn't that an anti-Christian idea?
Yes. What does that do to union? I mean, if
I'm on branches, you're the vine, you know, like we're all one. We're all different, you know, typical Bible speak, first, last, first. You know, we all have worth, and yet we're all interdependent. We're all one, but we're all, each person is different at the same time, and has just our very life has value. And yet, if our value becomes more than the person next to us, then the whole life starts to fall apart, the whole creation itself.
it's sometimes hard to be a part of a bigger concern, a bigger unit, because you have probably a pretty defined role to play. And we talk about that in the Bible, and that God's way on earth is that it's an organism, that each part has a role to play. Not everybody can be the brain. Not everybody can be.
Not everybody should either.
Some of us need to be something like maybe the cleanup crew or the whatever, you know, there is. But I wanted us to look at this one thing, because Connie always is talking about kindness, simple acts of kindness.
Kindness.
And this came from my issue of Scientific American, which is a journal for people who think science is great, etc. Well, here I was. That kindness goes farther than you think. And I'll shut up in a minute and let you read it and just see if you agree with this premise. He's coming at this not from a religious viewpoint, not at all from a religious viewpoint, but he's coming at it from a viewpoint of what does kindness do to the giver, and what does kindness do for the recipient? What does it do biologically for you, and what does it do for them? And there are two or three things in this that I had never thought about that made me feel a little bit more willing maybe to risk and to try to reach out to people more. Most of the time, many of us just walk around in our little orbit and don't bother to intersect with others. But read this and we'll see if you get the same thing from it that I do. Maybe we could do this together and go through it. That might be good. Like in the first two paragraphs, what's he say? She say it's a woman, I think. No, I'm not sure. A-M-I-T.
It's pictured right up here.
Oh, yes, okay, it's a
Well, I
man.
think it's nice.
I hope so.
It's really nice when people do things for you, because I know there's been a couple of times or recently that people have paid for my meals and stuff, and I'm like, you know, I'll start to pay and they'll say, no, it's already been taken care of. And I'll look around, and one place I went to Cracker Barrel one day, and I asked the waitress for my bill, and she said, it's already been taken care of. Well, I didn't know who had taken care of it, but the lady across from the table, she said, the people behind you paid for it, but they were already gone, so I couldn't thank them. But, you know, I just, you know, it's always surprising to me when somebody does pay for your meal or something, and I've tried to, I like to try to pass that on, you know, as people.
Play it forward, is that the
Yeah.
expression?
Well, and, you know, I've been in the grocery store, and sometimes people behind me or in front of me or somewhere pay for my groceries. And I'm like, you know, sometimes it almost embarrasses you, because you're like, you come up there to pay and somebody says, oh, it's already been taken care of, and you're like, what?
I told you that one of my students from the Sudan, there were three of them that came, and they came to church here for a long time while they were here. It was Joseph and Abraham and David, all biblical names. They were all Christians from Sudan. And they helped me, and I indirectly helped them some. Well, my son-in-law had some nice clothes that he didn't need, things like that. And they came to the house one time, and I had asked them if they'd come and help me with the yard. And I was going to pay them, and one of them said, you need to learn how to accept a gift. So I guess I was put in my place rather. So, but we do, but it was very generous of them to help me. Took their time and their energy, and I was very grateful.
Yeah. Can I say something to what Barbara was just saying? Carla came up with this idea that during Lent we would, whenever possible, instead of giving up something, we would do something for somebody else, give up some of what we had, and so when we find these opportunities, we've been doing them. You want to tell them about the Esperanza lunch? What happened?
Oh yeah, we were leaving the Esperanza lunch, and a young man came up to the desk. He was going to, get lunch, and it was on cash only. And he said, "Oh, I can't. I only have $4 in my pocket. I can't do it." And we heard that, so we went ahead and paid for his lunch, and he was very appreciative.
But my point to that, and that's why I started with Barbara here, is I'm thinking it starts out real small, but I'm hearing more and more of this going around. And the more we do it ourselves in our everyday lives,
it just starts spreading out. It's amazing how you don't know how something can happen, how it can move. It is crazy. It'll move faster than you do. And I'm thinking, I hear more and more of these stories about people on the receiving ends of these things. It's because some of us are doing these little things. When we find the opportunity, all of a sudden the world's getting a lot better place. We're achieving this justice rather than forcing the justice.
It doesn't have to be legislated.
Right. In matter of fact, it shouldn't be. It's harder to make it work if you're being forced, because we're independent here in this country.
Okay, and what is the reason why we don't do more of that? What prevents us? I saw a woman in the grocery store, and she was bent over her cart, and she was poorly dressed, and it was a cold day. And she was old like I am, you know.
Like you?
Yes. But she was having trouble with the cart and everything. And I wanted to help her, but I didn't because I was afraid that I would offend her sense
Or scare her.
that I would offend her sense of independence. Because there she was. She was making her own way.
May I tell a story?
Sure.
My fourth grade teacher was Lola B. Wild, and this was at Mars Hill Elementary. And my third grade teacher was Miss Carter, Miss Dan Carter, but I could not tell you what her given name was. She was Miss Carter to me at Mars Hill Elementary. And I remember my dad saying someone would come up to him and speak to him, and I'd say, who was it? He says, I don't know. And I would say, why didn't you ask? And he'd say, well, I didn't want to embarrass them by thinking that I didn't know who they were. So I started in those situations going up and saying, Miss Carter, you may not remember me, I'm Ann Phillips. And she said, I remember you, Ann, of course. And this was at the grocery store, Ingles. And one day I saw a lady. She had very white hair. No offense to those of us who have white hair. But anyway, she was trying to pick up one of those 6 or 8 packs of Cokes off of the bottom shelf. And she was just working at it. And I went over and I said, can I help you? And she looked at it and she said, sure you can. And I still had no clue who she was. She had to tell me who she was that day. So it was warming to me for that experience of how just going up to do a simple thing made us able to connect again after many years.
I just have a short story. It's very touching though. I used to do humanitarian work throughout the colleges around the world. But I lived in San Diego, so Mexico's right over the border. And we would get enough. We'd screen the children, and we would get enough to have, fill a full schedule with surgery. And one of the little girls, her eye was going this way, and so we had something right in front of her. Anyway, the mother handed the child to me. She was very fearful. We said, it will be all right. After they operated on her, her eye was straight. And I went to give the mother the baby. And I saw Jesus in her eyes. As he backed up, we're still looking at each other because Jesus was right there in the middle of it. That was really quite a story for me.
Well, that's a gift to be able to see Jesus in other people and to be able to recognize that. And I think we are inhibited because we are fearful that maybe we might get put down or rejected. We need to be a little tougher about that. My world's not going to end if someone says, no, I don't need your help, go away.
Can you think of an instance where Jesus had that happen to him? I was thinking of the rich man
And
Yeah.
that's what I was thinking.
and, you know, and how he approached that. But I think too often we wear our feelings on our sleeve, and we need to put that, I think, need to get over that.
Yeah, I agree.
I think we can increase people doing well by, when we do something for somebody, and if they're very appreciative and they thank us and they say, what can I do to pay you? And you can say, if you will do something for somebody else that needs it, that's the payment I want. But they increase it, cause that ball to roll, like John was talking about, to increase people being kind to each other.
Well, what this paper basically says is that the person who is doing the giving usually underestimates the impact that it will have. But even so, if you give something, you feel better. So there's a selfish motive in this. If you want to feel good, help somebody or do something for someone, and it makes more dopamine released into your system and you feel better. And it said that it also immeasurably helps the person who receives it because they begin to see the world in a different light as a place where there is help. Yes.
I just have a sort of a two-pronged comment to go with that. First, at least for me, I have to be careful not to stretch myself too thin, because I want to help everybody, and then you get burnout really quick and you're ineffective. So my mom, me being a jack of all trades, mom told me, she says, do a few things and do them really well. You can't do everything perfectly. And also, talking about like the small acts that go a long way. If you want to just trace it back far enough, my professor is the reason I'm sitting here. Dr. Jones, she's one of the leading theology professors at Carson Newman. I grew up in a church that didn't affirm women as ministers. I didn't even think that was a possibility. And, she was talking to me in little ways, and she was like, I really admire your passion for Christ, and I admire, I think you would be so good in a ministry setting. And she just sort of pulled back, and it's nothing that she did, like she didn't give me anything, but just pulling back those little layers of insecurity and that pain I grew up with, that being a woman made me not enough to serve God. And whenever I finally, decided to accept that calling to ministry, and I approached my childhood pastor about it, and his opening words were, you can't do that, you're a woman. I started looking for other avenues, and I landed here. So it's that chain reaction of just little kindnesses that have improved my world so much, and I've met, obviously, so many wonderful people.
And I think the thing that she gave you was time.
Yeah.
We always think about gifts as being material things, but time is probably the most precious gift you can give anyone.
Yeah.
And the quality of your time is an important thing too to think about. There are people in our church who need support and who need time.
Mm-hmm.
Did Barbara tell all of you she's having surgery Thursday? Barbara Chris is having it.
Whole batch.
I think it's not too severe, I don't believe, but sometimes it's spinal surgery Thursday.
And we have our connection with people across the street for whom a short visit might really be an important thing. And there are people in the congregation who are very sad. Some people are just really still dealing with a lot of loss. So
I know Wiley and Emily
yes,
appreciate the smallest of gestures.
Yes, they do.
So it's and they are so willing to give
Yeah.
that I think it's.
One of the things that mission and outreach, Paul has sort of stepped in while Emily's out to help keep mission and outreach going. And if you recall the sort of research that we got from the United Methodist Church, we looked at some of the 2018, 2019 research, and then we were able to get like the 2021, 2022 research, and it was interesting. Sort of the latest research is we had thought a lot about like children's ministries and things of that nature. That was pretty low priority for people across our community. But high priority for people across our community were things for retirees, and particularly grief and loss groups, which may make sense after the pandemic, or as wherever we are along the lines of the pandemic at this point. And so one of the things that Mission and Outreach is exploring is what would it take to potentially stand up a grief support group that may meet here and may combine something with Bride of Laurel, may even be something we could combine with the retirement home across the street. Not necessarily suggesting that it's just grief, but Roger, who's now been here, I think, every Sunday since he's been invited, his wife is at a separate facility in Weaverville. And so imagine what that separation has led to after they've been together for so many decades, and him being in Marcel, her being in Weaverville. So that might even be something that could help people experiencing something like that across the street.
I remember just before I went into knee surgery, just about to building in, and lo and behold, they're almost right on top of me, is Lisa and Wiley. And they say, he's going to be all right, we'll see you on the other end. That meant a lot to me to see those two.
Yeah, you think about it, we have, AA, NA and all that. Well, it's the same type of idea. It may not have to do with a specific physical thing that's causing mental and emotional turmoil, but just the fact that we have these tragedies in our lives. I don't know what you would call it, but it makes sense to have that kind of that's why what Heath is talking about. It makes sense to have something for that too.
Grief doesn't have to be something that's an immediate loss. It can be from someone who passed away years ago. And so, because grief doesn't necessarily go away. And so I think that even people who've had any type of loss, I even would include people who've had losses that are not physical losses, but emotional losses, like children who no longer have anything to do with their parents, or that type of thing.
Well, many of you know Laura, and her mother is in the home across the street and is winding down. And Laura is still dealing with the loss of her son, which is much more difficult, I think, than if the son had died just a natural death.
I never got over my mother. She died when she was 52, and we were like, umbilical cord was really cut. So I was miserable for all these years. I put a lot of it behind me, but the woman next door, her husband was dying. They were very devout Christians. So I went over and I started to say, I'm sorry about your husband. I broke down in tears. And she said, darling, you need to go to this grief school that they had in the last 10 weeks, 2 hours every Wednesday. And they had an actual movie that they showed you. And then afterwards we break into small groups and people would talk about their losses. Losing a child is the worst, I imagine, because they had a lot of people that lost children. After 10 weeks of that, I finally came to understand God didn't take my mother away. She died for
And death is inevitable, but we try to pretend that it's not, you know? It's a fact of life. And to have dealt with it over time and sequentially, some people have what I would consider to be normal kinds of experiences. And that is a comfort to them because they can get through it. But then there are shocking episodes that some other people have that are just like falling off a cliff.
The grief that I had from my mother, she had Alzheimer's. And so we lost her some time before she actually physically passed away. And it was easier for me to accept that. But my husband had an aneurysm burst, and he died within hours. And
Out of the blue.
yes, and with not a clue what was going on. But my minister came to me and told me that was the thief in the night that, resulted into his death. And that was a much more difficult grief to deal with, because it totally disrupted my life. Not only the loss, but all the things that went with it.
I did a class in college called Applications of Ministry, and we spent 7 weeks of a semester solely focusing on end of life and how to be with a family and with someone during their end of life. And right after that, a good friend of mine, she was in her 80s, she passed. And I really thought that because I had all this, knowledge, that I would be able to deal with it. And it doesn't really prepare you for real life, honestly. She was the first funeral I ever preached, and she was one of my closest friends.
Well, let's try to practice small acts of kindness this week as we go through. And if you are willing, please give us an update about what worked or did not work for you next week.
Thank you, JoAnn.
JoAnn, could I ask everybody something? How many of you are going to come to the pizza and game night Wednesday? 3.
Is it Wednesday?
Yes.
It's Wednesday.
Unfortunately, I will
At
not be
6
able
o'clock.
Pizza.
Pizza. I'll try.
So is your husband going
Oh, cool, game.
Yes.
to 4, 5?
I got a perfect game ball for that Friday.
What is your game?
Twister?
Oh, that's me,
Oh.
John. That's
I should have known that would be your game. Somehow or another, not surprised.
Stir the pot, see what happens.
No, just yourself.
Excuse me, John. May I have
Oh,
one?
I-
Yeah, kiss.
So where
No,
are you?
you're good. I just need this.
Actually, I'm not gonna bring that game, but I just thought I'd throw that out
Yeah.
there.
I don't think we
I am leaving the age group where I can bend like that.
I can't remember what that is.
I have never played that game.
Neither have I. I bet it'd be fun.
Might be fun.
You play with your grandkids, that's what it'd be fun.
I look, in my 20s, but I think my body is your age. Like, I have to go to the chiropractor. I'm taking vitamins for my joints. Like,
Yep.
Yep, that happens, but you're too young for that to happen.
one would think, but yeah. No, my boyfriend's 11 years older than me, and he makes fun of me. He's like, come on, make a little face.
Okay.
And I just lightly kick him in the chin and go, there you go, honey.
Did you call she?
I did. We went to New York, spent 4 days in New York.
I wondered when you were gone from here, because I knew you had been talking about going. How did it go? Did you have a good time?
We had a wonderful time. We went to the Met. We went to Broadway, we walked the Brooklyn Bridge. I got to meet his mom, a lot of his childhood friends.
You didn't have
I feel bad about that. We did like a random hard to Manhattan.
Yeah.